When the guns fell silent after the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, Europe entered what became known as the Phony War. From January to early May 1940, the Western Front remained eerily quiet. Behind this stillness, however, both sides were preparing for a decisive strike. France, Britain, and their allies reinforced the Maginot Line, believing its concrete fortifications and heavy artillery could block any German advance through the eastern frontier. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, steadily arrived in northern France, drilling and establishing supply lines, confident in the strategy of holding ground until a blockade and time weakened the Reich. Across the border, Adolf Hitler's generals debated the shape of the coming offensive. The original plan mirrored the Schlieffen approach of 1914, a sweeping push through Belgium and northern France. But in January 1940, a German aircraft carrying sensitive operational papers crashed in Belgium, forcing a complete revision of strategy. Out of this setback emerged the bold Manstein Plan, which concentrated the main thrust not in the north, but through the Ardennes, terrain the Allies considered too difficult for large-scale armored forces. This stroke of deception would define the campaign. While armies on both sides waited for spring, the air war began in earnest. German Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights probed deep into French territory, while RAF fighters and bombers launched limited raids over the Ruhr. Civilians in Paris and London followed these developments anxiously, knowing the quiet could end in an instant. The weather played its part too. Harsh winter conditions in January and February prevented large-scale operations, giving commanders time to refine logistics and move units into position. It was during this tense lull, in March and April 1940, that the war spread northward. Germany launched operations in Denmark and Norway to secure iron ore shipments from Sweden and deny the Royal Navy dominance in the North Sea. The Allies responded with their own naval and land forces in Norway, but these efforts were hastily organized and ultimately unsuccessful. The fall of Norway freed up key German divisions for the impending attack in the west, tilting the balance of forces further in Berlin's favor. By late April 1940, intelligence reports reached the Allied High Command warning of unusual German troop movements in the Eifel and along the Luxembourg frontier. Some officers suspected the Ardennes might not be as impassable as doctrine claimed, but these concerns were drowned out by the prevailing belief that the main assault would come via Belgium. The French Plan D, which called for an advance into Belgium to meet the German thrust head-on, remained the chosen course of action. And as these decisions hardened, so too did the sense that events were moving toward a breaking point. By early May, the pieces were in place for a campaign that would determine the fate of Western Europe. Before we move deeper into the opening blows of this conflict, make sure to subscribe, like, and share so you won't miss the full breakdown of how this lightning campaign unfolded in just 6 weeks. At dawn on May 10, 1940, the long-anticipated German offensive in the west began. Without a formal declaration of war, Wehrmacht forces surged into Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The speed of the assault shocked the Allies. In the north, paratroopers of the Luftwaffe's Fallschirmjäger seized key bridges and airfields in the Netherlands, including the daring capture of the Belgian fortress of Ebenemael, neutralizing one of the most formidable defensive positions in Europe within a single day. This northern push appeared to confirm Allied expectations. The Germans were repeating their World War I strategy. Reacting quickly, the French First Army, the British Expeditionary Force, and the Belgian Army advanced into Belgium under the provisions of Plan D. Their goal was to meet the enemy head-on and halt the invasion well before it reached French soil. For the first 48 hours, this maneuver seemed to unfold as planned, with Allied forces linking up and establishing defensive lines along the Dill River. But the real danger was not in Belgium. South of the main fighting, through the wooded hills and narrow roads of the Ardennes, the true German hammer blow was falling. Panzer divisions under Generals Guderian, Hoth, and Reinhardt pushed through Luxembourg and into southern Belgium with astonishing speed. Contrary to Allied assumptions, the dense forests and winding valleys did not slow the armored columns. Engineers and pioneers cleared obstacles, while Luftwaffe bombers targeted road junctions and communications hubs to paralyze any organized resistance. On May 12, German spearheads reached the Meuse River near Sedan, Dinant, and Muntherm. Here, the French had positioned weaker divisions, assuming the terrain would protect them. Instead, they faced an onslaught of coordinated air and artillery bombardment. In Sedan, the Luftwaffe mounted one of the most intense concentrated bombing campaigns of the war to date, pounding French positions for hours. Morale began to crack under the relentless pressure. The next day, May 13, the Panzers launched their river crossings. Inflatable boats and quickly assembled bridges allowed German infantry to establish footholds on the far bank. Once the bridgeheads were secure, tanks and motorized infantry poured across. The French counterattacks, launched in haste, lacked coordination and air support. By evening, Guderian's units had not only secured Sedan but also begun driving deep into the open countryside beyond. On May 14, the scale of the breakthrough became undeniable. The French front along the Meuse was collapsing. German armor fanned out into the rear areas, threatening to cut off the Allied forces now committed in Belgium. That same day, the Luftwaffe devastated the Dutch city of Rotterdam in a massive air raid, forcing the Netherlands to surrender soon after. The psychological impact across the Allied command was immediate. This was no repeat of 1914, this was a new kind of war, one built on speed, shock, and the destruction of the enemy's command structure before they could react. By the morning of May 15, 1940, the French High Command was in crisis. General Gamelin, the commander-in-chief, received urgent reports from Sedan that the German advance was accelerating beyond all expectations. The armored spearheads of Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps had broken free of the Meuse bridgehead and were racing west into the heart of France. Entire French divisions were bypassed, their supply lines cut, their command structures disoriented. At Charleville, Laon, and Rethel, stunned French troops attempted to form new defensive lines, but the German pace made such efforts futile. Radio intercepts and reconnaissance flights confirmed the worst. The German objective was not Paris, at least not yet, but the English Channel itself. If successful, this maneuver would trap the British Expeditionary Force, the Belgian Army, and several French armies in a vast pocket in northern France and Belgium. Meanwhile, in Belgium, the Allies were still heavily engaged along the Dyle and Escaut rivers, unaware of the full scale of the southern breakthrough. Communications between the northern Allied forces and the French High Command in the south became increasingly erratic due to Luftwaffe strikes on telephone exchanges and railway hubs. Every hour lost allowed German armor to extend its lead. On May 16, the situation worsened when Guderian's panzers seized Stenay and Montcornet, brushing aside light French counterattacks led by Colonel Charles de Gaulle's 4E Division Cuirassiers. Though de Gaulle's assault temporarily delayed the German timetable, it was not enough to halt the momentum. That same day, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud telephoned Winston Churchill, telling him bluntly, "We are beaten, we have lost the battle." The German advance was now a rolling wave. Motorized infantry followed the tanks in long convoys, while Stuka dive bombers roamed ahead, striking bridges, fuel depots, and troop concentrations. On May 17, the panzers reached the Oise River, widening the breach in the French front to over 60 miles. The speed of the movement left even some German commanders uneasy, fearing overextension, but Hitler, reassured by his generals, allowed the push to continue. By May 19, the leading elements of the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions were approaching Amiens, cutting the vital road and rail links between northern France and Paris. This severed the primary supply route for the British Expeditionary Force. The BEF, under Lord Gort, began to reassess its position. With the Belgian front still active and the French collapsing to the south, the prospect of encirclement was now a stark reality. On May 20, German tanks of the 2nd Panzer Division reached Abbeville on the Somme estuary, effectively sealing off the Allied armies in the north from the rest of France. The swiftness of this move stunned the Allies. The entire operation from Sedan to the Channel had taken barely a week. By May 21, the Germans were strengthening their corridor to the sea, repelling counterattacks near Arras. Although British and French forces fought with determination, including a notable tank assault led by British Matildas, the German grip on the Channel coast remained firm. The trap was now closing. By May 22, 1940, the Allied situation in northern France had become perilous. The German corridor from Sedan to Abbeville was now solid, stretching over 100 miles in length and guarded by panzer divisions on both flanks. Inside this pocket were the British Expeditionary Force, the Belgian Army, and the French First Army, over 400,000 troops. Outside, in the south, the French government struggled to coordinate a counteroffensive that could reopen the corridor, but the clock was ticking. On that day, the Allies attempted a breakout near Arras. British and French armor, including the heavily armored Matilda I and II tanks, punched through elements of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, causing temporary alarm. German anti-tank guns were overrun, and Rommel himself narrowly avoided capture. But the success was fleeting. Lacking air support and infantry reserves, the attackers were forced to withdraw by nightfall. The German advance resumed almost immediately. By May 24, the German spearheads had reached the AA Canal near Dunkirk. Then, unexpectedly, Hitler issued the infamous halt order, instructing the panzers to stop their advance for 2 days. Debate still rages among historians about this decision. Some argue it was due to concerns about overextension or the need to rest armored units. Others believe Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe had promised to finish the destruction from the air. Whatever the reason, this pause gave the Allies a narrow but crucial window. During those 2 days, the British initiated Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the BEF and as many French and Belgian troops as possible from Dunkirk's beaches. Naval vessels of all sizes, from destroyers to civilian fishing boats, were mobilized across the English Channel. On May 26, the first evacuations began under constant Luftwaffe bombardment. The shallow beaches forced troops to wade into the water, boarding small craft that ferried them to larger ships offshore. While the evacuation proceeded, the Belgian army fought desperately to hold the German advance along the Isère River. King Leopold III, facing the collapse of his lines and the destruction of his forces, surrendered unconditionally on May 28. This left the northern flank of the Dunkirk perimeter dangerously exposed. By May 30, the perimeter was shrinking under relentless pressure. French troops held the line at Lille in a determined stand, engaging 7 German divisions and buying vital hours for the evacuation. The resistance at Lille, though ending in surrender, was later recognized as one of the heroic actions of the campaign. Despite constant air attacks and artillery fire, the evacuation exceeded expectations. By June 4, 1940, 338,000 soldiers, including more than 100,000 French troops, had been evacuated to Britain. Yet the operation was no victory. The Allies left behind almost all their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, and vehicles littered the beaches. The Northern Allied armies had been saved from total destruction, but France itself now lay exposed to the next phase of the German assault. With the evacuation from Dunkirk complete, France faced the grim reality that the bulk of its northern armies were gone, either evacuated without equipment or captured. The German High Command wasted no time in launching Fall Rot, Case Red, the second phase of their campaign. On June 5, 1940, 3 German army groups advanced south across the Somme and Aisne rivers, meeting a weakened French defense that lacked reserves and armor. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Every French counterattack was met with concentrated bombing that shattered formations before they could gain momentum. The once proud French Air Force was reduced to small, scattered sorties. On the ground, German armored divisions exploited breaches in the line, forcing retreats before defenses could be consolidated. By June 9, the Germans had crossed the Seine. Paris was now threatened, and French command struggled to organize a coherent defense. The government, led by Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, debated whether to continue the fight or seek terms. General Charles de Gaulle, newly appointed as Under-Secretary of War, urged resistance and even proposed moving the government to North Africa to continue the war from the colonies. But morale was collapsing. On June 10, as Italy declared war on France, another front opened in the southeast. Italian forces crossed the Alpine border, though their progress was limited by mountainous terrain and stiff French resistance. Still, the psychological impact of a second enemy was severe. That same day, the French government fled Paris for Tours, leaving the capital vulnerable. German forces approached the outskirts of Paris by June 13. Declared an open city to prevent destruction, the French abandoned it without a fight. The Wehrmacht entered the city on June 14, marching past the Arc de Triomphe in a symbolic display of conquest. Across the country, French units were surrendering en masse, unable to halt the German tide. In the Loire Valley, scattered French forces tried to form new defensive lines, but the speed of the German advance made coordination impossible. Refugees clogged the roads, slowing military movement. On June 16, Paul Reynaud resigned, replaced by Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of World War I. Pétain immediately sought an armistice, declaring that the fighting must cease. Negotiations began at Compiègne on June 21, in the same railway carriage where the 1918 armistice ending World War I had been signed. Hitler deliberately chose the location to humiliate France. The terms were harsh. Germany would occupy northern and western France, including the entire Atlantic coast, while the south would be administered by a collaborationist regime based in Vichy. The armistice came into effect on June 25, 1940. In just 6 weeks, the German blitzkrieg had toppled one of Europe's great powers. Over 90,000 French soldiers had been killed, and millions were displaced. Britain now stood alone against Nazi Germany in Western Europe, facing the looming threat of invasion. The Battle of France was over, but for Britain, and for the world, the war had only just begun.